My name is Mishka Reddy, and I'm joined by my colleague, Diane Selman. And I wanted to start off by saying that, or to provide this sort of disclaimer or just this catch-all to say that there's not one way or two or three ways to get to know your students. There are many ways to get to know your students. And it will depend a lot on how your class is taught, the size of your class, the workload, how many lecturers are incoming or teaching on a particular block. And so this is not a magic wand that once you have applied these three tools that you will have successfully gotten to know your students correctly and the right way. There is no such thing. What we in fact want to offer up, and we will get into this when we contextualize the session within the Enable framework and the other subsequent webinars that are being run by SILT in another one this week and two more next week, is that these are just options for how you could approach getting to know your students. But before we move on to the agenda and any such thing, I would like to practice what we preach, and I would like to ask for an opportunity to get to know the people in this room. So if I could ask you to think, I think when you filled in or you signed up for this webinar, you were asked a question about what your goal or objective was for attending this webinar, what you were hoping to get out of it. You can share that same response that you shared in that sign up, or you can go ahead and share a new one. But before you click enter, I want you to wait for my go ahead. So open up the chat space and write a sentence or two about what it is that you're hoping to get out of attending a webinar of this nature. And when I give you the instruction, you click enter, and we'll see it all come through, as my colleagues like to refer to it as a waterfall. So yeah, you're going to just think of one sentence, and then I'll give you the go ahead to press enter. And I'm going to stop sharing because I'm not sure how to not share and look at the chat simultaneously, and that is a deficit on my side. But yeah, so you should see people chatting, typing, and when I give the go ahead, you click enter or send. Okay. And 3, 2, 1, enter. Awesome. Oh, it's amazing. Great. Wow. Well, it's my absolute pleasure to be in a room with people who just want to learn about the Enable framework, or they're wondering about simple ways for getting to know their students, wanting to make sense of classes of up to 200 students. Michelle D'Souza, I'm looking at you. As a new or first-time lecturer, wanting to know how we can engage with a bigger group, how to get some fresh ideas, different ways of getting to know our students in order to incorporate this into our teaching, and also just to have people in the room who are here to support us as colleagues in sharing this knowledge. You can go ahead and keep sharing if you didn't get a chance to do so, but I'm going to proceed and I will read your responses. As I mentioned, this topic is very close to my heart, and as well as to Diane's heart. And we've been actually been doing workshops on Wooclap and Padlet. So this was a great opportunity to share some of what we've been sharing in other spaces. But this work is really contextualized within the Enable framework. Enable stands for Enabling Accessible Blended Learning for Equity. And this framework arises from a larger project called the Redesigned Blended Courses Project. And the Enable framework is just one aspect of this work. Its purpose was a means to get some easy ways to use technology to learn more about students, to be supportive to co-workers, all the reasons that you have mentioned in the comments. It's really the essence behind why this Enable framework exists. But as I said, it arises out of that RBC project, which made efforts towards realizing universal design for learning principles in course design. And what that is just intentional in promoting inclusive, digitally enabled learning. This might seem obvious. This might seem obvious. It also may raise a question for you as to who wouldn't want to do that? Who would want to inherently limit access to students? But I think I want to contextualize this webinar is to say that knowledge and by extension teaching and how we choose to present that knowledge and our approach in teaching is not neutral. So there's always assumptions being made about who is on the receiving end of that teaching. And the Enable framework, UDL and the Enable framework is saying that at the design stage, there are ways to ensure intentionality around designing accessible learning, accessible here in all forms. And that's really the point of this work. So it covers all this ground, and those webinars that I spoke to will conscientize those who attend to various aspects of the Enable framework. Here's another way that the Enable framework was envisioned, and it will take the form of a website in its final iteration, or I shall say in its where it will live. It will be in a website form, but it will continue to be developed and worked on. So why are we having this webinar? I guess what hinges on it is this question about why is it actually important to get to know your students? And really understanding the diverse backgrounds that our students come from, acknowledging their unique experiences and needs, and learning what knowledge, skills, and values they bring to the table. It ultimately enables an enhanced learning experience for the students that they can connect with, but also optimizes opportunities for student engagement. And so we're going to share three ways in which, I think it's over here, 3 ways in which you could go about doing this. You've got 3 options. The first is through something called a pre-course survey, which Diane will speak to. The second will be through Wooclap, which I will speak to, and then finally Padlet, which Diane will close us off with. Okay, I hand over to you, Diane.
Thank you so much, Mishka, for that. So what we did was we created a pre-course survey, which ideally we would suggest sharing a few weeks prior to actually your course starting, just so you can kind of get a nice sense of who your incoming cohort are. We do have a template that we will link at the end of our slides, and we will share with you at the end of our presentation that you can use to recreate your own course survey. You could do it using, Google Forms. In our case, we have used MS Forms, and I will just share my screen so I can give you a little bit of an idea of what goes into that. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Just been having a few tech issues, so I have to make sure. Okay, so in our pre-course survey, I think it's just important, as Mishka mentioned, to ask what would be prescient to yourself as the convener or the lecturer to kind of understand your students. So in our context, of course, where we have 12 languages of communication, I think a nice way to always start would be, asking a question like, what languages do you most commonly use at home? Which, of course, leads into another question about the English language, which is our medium of teaching at the University of Cape Town, and how that fits in with your teaching. So we've seen a few courses where they have used translanguaging, and this would be an opportunity learning, what languages your students speak and how you could incorporate what they speak into the classroom. And thereby obviously creating an environment where students don't feel so excluded, where they feel like their languages are valued and where they feel like their backgrounds are also valued. So language is quite important. What we've seen as well is lecturers using the language aspect for multilingual glossaries for certain concepts or certain theories that they ask students to translate into their own languages, which is quite interesting. So that would be one relevant way of using it. So as you can see here, that just goes more into talking about the languages. Of course, you may want to know what the goals and ambitions are for your students and why they're taking their class. This would, I guess, be mostly relevant, especially if you're doing a postgraduate level type course. There'll be an important question to ask. How do students learn? Giving 3 to 5 things that make your learning experience great for you, because this would, of course, inform how you're going to set up your course. What knowledge do they have around the subject that you're teaching? And of course, in terms of tech, that is also a limiting factor for some of the students. So it may be good to get that sort of information ahead of time. Particularly for first year type courses, it is also interesting to know the level of digital skills that your students have. So are they able to use Word? Are they able to use Google Docs? PowerPoint, if they're going to be doing things like presentations? Do they know how to access Google Scholar and all of that? And if they would need any kind of mediation in terms of that, so either pointing them toward the library or in some way or form incorporating that into your course. And what are their various learning needs? I think this one is also important, particularly if you have students that are coming in that are neurodiverse. So are they, you may have dyslexic students who may need extra time on exams or tests, etc. You may have students who are visually impaired or, they are deaf. Just any kind of learning disability. This gives you some ideas on what you could ask with that. The other thing I think would be in terms of thinking about your assessment strategies, getting some sort of idea of how students would appreciate being assessed. So, if you've been doing take-home exams, has that been working? Has that not been working? Will it work going forward for the kind of students that you have in the next cohort? Etc., etc. We also think it's important to understand, as we said, the economic backgrounds, the social backgrounds, all of that comes into play. So these are just a few. We are not suggesting that you use every single one of them. As I said, our template does offer you guiding questions to think about in creating your own. So please feel free to use the template that we've provided you with at the end. I'll hand it back to you, Mishka. If you have any questions, please feel free to jump in and ask. But I'll hand it back to you now, Mishka. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Diane. And thank you for guiding us through the comprehensive types of questions that one could ask in a pre-course survey before even getting students in the room. So in a way, preemptively, I think somebody shared when they signed up for the webinar, they really wanted to start off on the right foot. This is a great mechanism for doing that, and it can be as comprehensive or as simple as you wish. Another type of mechanism, and I want to just play from here, is through Wooclap, which is a third-party tool, but that integrates with Amatuba, the learning management system that we have migrated to, but it also integrates with Wooclap. So if you are still teaching on Wooclap, or you have now migrated to Amatuba because you're teaching a first-year course, Wooclap integrates with both. What Wooclap is a tool that enables or promotes interactive learning by incorporating the use of students' mobile devices. It also allows you in the room to pose questions to a large group of students. So if you are working with students in large groups, it will be an opportunity to see or hear everybody's voice. But it can also be provided, provide an asynchronistic task, meaning you could post it within the Amatuba or Wooclap learning management space, and students could, at their own convenience, engage with the question and engage with the particularities of the questions that you're posing to them. So any one of those questions that Diane highlighted in the pre-course survey could be turned into a Wooclap question. A question housed within Wooclap. It's at this point that I just want to add, before I go into the examples of Wooclap, and I should have said this at the start, or we should have said this at the start of the webinar, is that oftentimes the technology is seen as the be-all and end-all, but really it is how it is introduced into the space and used in the in-person and explained by the lecturer that will speak to its uptake. Oftentimes, or we speak about thinking about the pedagogical horse pulling the technological cart, but what we're encouraging you to do is to think about how to entangle these things. How can using any of this technology, either support how you're teaching in person or create more space in the digital after class has ended. So with that, here is Wooclap. And as I said, the first thing to note is that it can be used in an asynchronistic way, meaning that within an Amatuba space like you're seeing on your screen right now, you could embed a Wooclap task that students could engage with outside of the lecture theatre or outside of the actual class time. In the example I'm going to show you, we're taking some of the same questions that Diane indicated in that pre-course survey and asking students to engage with that. So for example, what languages do you use most commonly at home? And here students can fill it in and fill in multiple responses at a time as they would like. So something like that. And we'll see a response pop up and populate for the student. But what's also an added benefit of Wooclap is that it can also be used in live polls and live voting. So in the same way, you could share this very same link with students in class, and as they populate the responses, it will also populate live time. So in effect, you could share the screen with students and ask them to add their responses to the question. And as students add their responses, it will populate in the room live time. And if many students wrote a particular language, it would present bigger in the word cloud, for example, over here. You'll see that I just clicked now into Wooclap. You don't have to embed this within the learning management system. So this is not something that you have to integrate into Vula or Amatuba. You could just use this as a standalone. Like if you wanted to, in the first session, just ask a couple of questions to your students in the classroom, and you want everyone to see the responses. This can have a really impactful, this can really have a really high impact to see these word clouds form in the room, just to get a sense of who is joining for that particular course. Okay, over to you, Dan.
So I was just wondering if we, while we're at it, if we have any comments or questions thus far that anyone would like to contribute.
Can I say something? Do you mind?
Yes.
Janet here. I just
go ahead.
What's quite nice about the Wooclap model is that you can almost instantly do feedback to the students while you're doing the questions, which is one of the core the sort of loops you need to close. So you're looking to get to know your students, but you also need to be sharing some of that. So that is quite an interesting way that you don't have to then compile your questionnaire results and find a way of sharing it. It would come back if you used Wooclap. But that would have to be sync in the classroom, right, Mishka and Dai?
Yes, correct. So you would have to share something like this. The students would, and let's actually just go ahead. Thank you for raising that, Janet. Students would go ahead and you would share with them this link, for example, and on their phones, they would then fill in that response, and in live time, the students can see all of those responses. It obviously doesn't work with if you're sitting in a large lecture venue and you've got students writing long paragraphs. That might be a better mechanism for that sort of sharing, might be Padlet, and Diane will get into that. But Wooclap is great for these high impact, quick feedback questions, like a question like what language, what is your home language, or simple yes, no, maybe questions, things that can immediately visually see what the group response is. Thanks for the question, Janet, or for the comment. It's really useful in terms of saying what is the benefit of Wooclap. In really bad facilitator style, they've stopped to ask any questions, so thank you, Dan. Are there any other questions about surveys or Wooclap before we power onto Padlet?
We have a comment from Stella, which I think is really nice. A pre-course survey, it is ideal to have a combination of both closed and open-ended questions. The technology, MS Forms, Google Forms, you can get visual feedback on the closed-ended questions, but the open-ended questions need to be post-coded, especially for large classes. So asking all open-ended questions would make the feedback less immediately comprehensible. Yeah, I think that's the great thing about having the form and the template questions that we have in the use the Enable framework, because they do allow you to really think about what you want to have in your particular survey for your particular course and to service your particular needs. So as we said, very useful to just have a look at that and to manipulate it in ways that work for you. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about Padlet. Can you, shall I share my screen, Mishka, or?
Yeah, go for it. Let me just stop sharing. Oh, I don't think I am sharing, so you can go for it.
Okay. Okay, so we will start here. Okay, so just making sure, can everyone see my screen again?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so we'll start at the very beginning. For those of you who haven't heard about Padlet. It's basically a little bit like a bulletin board. So it's a nice space for information that you would want everybody to have access to. And we do have access to it through our UCT email accounts. Again, we've provided a link at the end of our presentation with a guide on how you can create your own Padlet account. It is basically uctpadlet.org. And this is the screen that you would get from that. But why would we want to use Padlet? So Padlet would be great for your smaller classes. If you're just trying to do things like introductory activities. So in this example that I'm showing right now, we have an activity page. This is our lesson page that basically gives our students an estimation of the time it's going to take to do this activity. It tells them what the activity actually is. You're going to introduce yourself to the class. And why would you use this if you're doing a face-to-face? So oftentimes in a classroom scenario, there's not enough time to go around the entire class and everybody just chat about who they are and what they do, right? So this is kind of a nice space, a nice online space for them to come in, really think about their responses. And again, you could provide prompts for them to respond to on the Padlet board. So the other nice thing about Padlet, it does allow you, if you notice here, it says once you've posted, please take a few minutes to read posts made by others. And because of its social media-esque nature, students can like comments. They can also include things like GIFs. They can include pictures. They can also include a little bit of audio or video. Of course, the caveat there would have to be just make sure your images are low res so that they don't take forever and ever to load. But yeah, so this would kind of be an example of an introduction. And what does that look like, if you are asking? Okay, so this is a Padlet that I just created for this presentation. So at the top there, as I mentioned about prompts, in a short paragraph, tell us where you're from, what languages you speak, and what you're hoping to gain from taking this class. And I give a little bit of guidance there. I say, click on the big yellow plus sign on the bottom of the Padlet window and add your contribution. So I did mention GIFs. I'm exceedingly excited to be here. So as my GIF is showing, I tell you who I am, and I've enabled the functionality that my name appears at the top of the post. Padlet allows you also to do this anonymously. So you can switch off the functionality that shows the student names. So if you just want them to contribute on, things they may be a little less inclined to have their names on, questions they may be a little less inclined to have their names on, you could just post those here. So what other ways, why would this be a good way? Because firstly, it's colorful. It's fun because it does mirror, as I said, social media. And what we found is it does tend to encourage a little more engagement than, simply say putting this in a discussion space. Okay. So while we're on the topic of discussion space, depending on whatever topic you are teaching, it's always a good idea, I guess, you can learn about your students through the responses that they give, depending on whatever the topic is. So I've noted here that it does encourage their own critical thinking, and they can contribute their ideas while also learning from others. And this ultimately prompts other ideas. So the idea of co-creating within the learning process, and while doing that, I do think you get a better sense of who your students are just in how they're interacting in the conversations that they are having in the in the classroom space. The other thing about this obviously would be to kind of get a sense of, where are your students at? Do they seem to be understanding the material? Are they a little bit lost? Would you need to remediate a little bit? Would you need to create a remedial model just based on some of the things that you're seeing in those chat spaces? So the chat space of Padlet. So I'll just quickly share an example of what I've just mentioned now. So this would be an example sort of a group discussion. So again, certain topics are a little contentious, others are not so much. Depending on the topic, if I wanted to, I could have my students posting anonymously. In this case, the students were posted in groups. They were put into groups and they had to post their answers in groups. Okay, so again, we learn a little bit more about our students through this. The other way that this would be useful would be in terms of your question and answers and your check-ins. So we highly suggest sort of probably at the end of each term, doing a little bit of a check-in, or every few weeks, just doing a temperature check on how your students are doing at any given point. So you could, if you wanted to, in the example that I will show you shortly, you could do a check even before the class has fully started, even before they've delved into the content. You could do a quick check-in there, especially if they're first years. This one does count. Or as you're further down the line, how are they coping? Are they managing all of that? Again, our questions in our template that we've provided may give you some sort of guidance on what questions to ask, but I'll just show you quickly here an example as well. So in this example, we have students who are being asked what they, what are they feeling at the moment about being at UCT. So these were made anonymous, but again, as I said, a great way to kind of gauge where your students are at. And this was only one question, but you can make this a series of questions depending on the layout that you choose in Padlet. You could create a series of questions. What do I mean by that? Let me just quickly jump to this and I will show you. So this was for particular learning activity. You notice this is using a shelf layout and there are different questions. These are not necessarily to do with what we're speaking on, but just to give you an idea of what it could look like when they are responding. So the other thing I mentioned was also using this as a question and answer space. If students are perhaps just afraid to ask within the class space, they could just ask whatever questions that they need to ask within a Padlet and have the lecturer respond at any given time. So I've created a basic one, but yes, we have.
Megan had a question for you.
Yes, please go ahead.
Can students, Megan, do you want to unmute yourself and just ask the question?
Sorry, Megan, I just stopped sharing so I can see my screen too.
Oh, sure, no problem. I was just referring to your activity 3, where students can comment on a question, and I see what it looks like, I presume, for you as the user or the lecturer, but would all the students in the class see all those responses, or would they only just come to you?
No, the responses are embedded within the learning page. So if I just go back to my little share screen, so if we use this example, right? all of these responses are embedded within this is a learning page. Let's assume this is a course. This is visible to everybody. So
Okay.
I think this is also why it's been made anonymous, because everybody in the class gets to see this. So I can scroll down. If I'm a student, I can scroll down and I can look at this. If I am the lecturer, there are obviously certain things that there are certain limitations that I could put. So, you know, things like just making sure, you know, I think there's functionality that allows an up and a down voting thing. I could cancel the down vote and just make sure there's only an up vote. I could moderate the responses if I wanted to. That's a functionality that I can turn on within the Padlet platform itself. So there are things to do.
Okay. So I mean, I guess
depending on the settings.
What I'm wondering is, so as a lecturer, I would love to know my students' individual fears or feelings. But obviously that some students wouldn't want their peers to know. So instead of those responses coming as anonymous, it would be so nice if the lecturer could see actually who said that. So then they know, okay, I need to give a little bit more time to this person, or especially if you have a small class like I do, I do get to know my students individually. So it's a shame that there's no function for the lecturer or whoever poses the question to see the names of the students, but then the students see just anonymous, if that makes sense.
Yes, making it anonymous to the rest of the class, but making it so that you as the lecturer are able to see who has made the post.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understood that.
Okay.
So I haven't, sorry, go ahead. Someone was about to speak.
No, I was just going to say that I can see Cheryl's typing in the chat. Maybe, Cheryl, you have a response to that comment. If you
Yes,
yeah.
I do. So if you want the students to disclose to you and not to anybody else, a strategy to do is to use an online survey. So either your MS forms or your Google Forms, not your Google Forms, yeah, Google Forms. And then require the students to provide their email address. Then the report that comes back only to you will have their names associated with the comments. The other value for the students, and you're going to give them benefit as well, is that if you use such a thing at the beginning of a term, and then midway through the term, you have another opportunity for feedback, and at the end of term, if you ask for the emails right in the beginning, you can say to the students, if you give your email right in the beginning, you will get a copy of what you said. And then they can use that copy of what they said to reflect more specifically on how they're feeling now, midway through the course and at the end of the course. Did that help, Mishka?
And yeah, that helped me, certainly. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I think just to add to Cheryl's point, what is most important to remember there is the pre-course survey really is, it's a very nice option for you to pivot and adjust. So, you know, if you were thinking about doing something one particular way, when you get those survey responses, it does put you in the position where you now have to, you can rethink a little bit before the course actually starts. So I think it's great for that. Sorry, was someone speaking?
No?
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think I had just one more thing about getting to know what your students know. I think so. Padlet, again, depending on your course, what do my students know? what do they know about the material I'm teaching, etc. So for, this is just a prior knowledge use case is one example that you could use Padlet for. I just would like to mention again that I think Padlet is awesome, but particularly in smaller classes. I think when you have your courses going into the thousands and all of that, it becomes tricky to manage a Padlet. And also it's just the responses are too many, so the scrolling becomes too much. And so the other way that I would also do this is, because some people say, well, my class is 200 students. I like Padlet, but that's 200 responses on one page. The other way to do it would be to also create your tutorial groups and have Padlets for each tutorial group, which still creates nicer, smaller spaces in which discussions can be had, as opposed to having, say, a boring discussions, because obviously they can add pictures, they can add gifts, emoticons of, varying degrees. And it just makes learning a little bit more fun in that way. So,
awesome.
Yeah, that is.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And I think, Megan, you raised such a useful point, which is that it's great to gather this information and have it. And Diane, you completely drove the reason home, which is that what do we do with that information? Where does it make sense for it to be living, and how does the context in which you're teaching, or the space that you're in, how is that tool useful for that space? And then, to your point, Megan, how do we get that information back to students and to us in either knowing who needs more help, or if we should, just add supplementary work or spend extra time on a particular topic of discussion. And so, that's exactly the point of these tools, is that if, for example, you are going to use them in smaller groups, in tutorials, that the practice should be to share that information back to the teaching team, so that everybody is cognizant of the information that has been received from the students, including the students themselves. And Cheryl, you raise a really great strategy for having students engage with their own reflection, their own responses at various checkpoints throughout the course. So that brings us now to the end of the webinar. We, as said at the beginning, of course, there's no one way of getting to know your students. These are not the only tools that you can use for getting to know your students, and there are very many ways in which you could use Padlet, Wooclap, or MS Teams or Google Forms to get that kind of information about your students and get students engaging and collaborating with each other and learning about each other. And so, as the SILT team, if you are inspired by this webinar and you're interested in using any of these tools or these options, and you want to try something, but you need a sounding board, or you have questions still, or you just want to talk some more about any of these tools, you can please reach out to SILT for consultation with the learning designer. We will also share the resources in terms of this presentation itself, and how to use Wooclap, how to use Padlet, and the template for questions for a pre-course survey that Diane mentioned at the top of this. Other than that, I'd just like to, before end off, ask if there are any final questions, anything.
Comments.
Comments. Oh, Michelle, we'll email it to you, or post it in maybe this team space. I think that's what we'll do.
Okay, hold a second. I will get that in a sec.
Cool, thank you. Thank you for the comment, Cheryl. Any ideas to feedback and the responses to
Nadine has a question.
I think I have more, maybe it's a comment, I don't know. I think just an opportunity that's when you do these things within a classroom setup, it's so useful, because the UDL principle that applies here is the principle of engagement. So it's not just fostering the engagement between the lecturer and the student, but also harnessing the opportunities of students engaging with one another. And I think setting up your questions is thus so crucially important for your course. So, you as the lecturer that has the discipline-specific knowledge would know which type of students naturally gravitate to one another, because we want to encourage these communities of practice, etc. And I think by asking the right type of questions and by answering, because I've been, in an online course as a student, I like to take online courses, and then, you can see based on the Padlet responses, this person is like me. And then in your discussions naturally further along in the course, these students could. So I want to encourage people to think of not just understanding the student from your own point of view, but also allowing them to get to know each other in different spaces.
Perhaps one example that we recently used at UCT was around the actual knowledge. What did people know about a certain topic? And our options included, I have no idea what this is. And what was really helpful, it was to do with Python and HTML. But what was really helpful is when we fed this information back to the lecturers, back to the students, in the little PowerPoint presentation, about 75% of the students had no idea what that particular thing was. And that acted to really normalize the students' anxiety about how much the other people know. Because when you come into university for the first time, you think everybody knows everything except yourself. So this kind of, and using language like, I have no idea what this is, or I really hate this way of assessment or something, kind of is a little bit more emotive. So, yeah, that might be another idea.
Thank you, Cheryl, for that. I fully agree with the feedback loop, not just being a sort of a one-way sort of street, but I think it's important, for you to share those responses. It's nice to see stuff, but it's nice to share the information back to them. Megan, you had a question or a comment?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to agree with Cheryl's comment in the chat. Students absolutely need to know or hear from each other, because they do feed off each other. So with that example in Padlet, again, going back to that, arranging this type of check-in, I think, is so important, not only for the lecturer, but also for the students to see it sort of, to add to Cheryl, for the students to see that they're not alone. But that's again why I wondered whether it could be anonymized, but at the same time for the lecturer to know which student said what. So that's why I was so interested in that particular activity on Padlet, because I wouldn't want to do something like that and just only I get the responses. I think it's so important that the students get get to see the responses too. And then it actually then encourages others to then add to the discussion, because they can see that actually they're not the only ones thinking the same thing.
Yeah. Very, very true. Very true. And sharing of the survey responses doesn't look as nice as in the Padlet space, but it could serve the same function, that the students would still see anonymized the feedback, but it would require an additional step. Yeah, but I do hear your point. Cool. Any other final questions, comments, concerns? Anybody that's going to be like, I'm going to take up one of these tools, I'm going to use this at the start of my course this semester.
Yeah, I would be very excited to assist.
Yes, me. Awesome, Stella. That's so great. Cool.
That's a win from us. Well, thank you so much, everybody. As we said, we will be sharing all of the resources with you. And please don't ever hesitate to reach out to us if you need any assistance on any level. We are happy always to assist. So these tools can be used at different times in the course. Yes. Thank you, Cheryl, for adding that pre-course, mid-course, all the way. It's always important to check in with your students because their needs change. As the course goes on, their needs change. So it's important to check in. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Hope everybody has a warm afternoon.